Good morning or good afternoon, my dear colleagues. That picture was taken 2 years ago in Borgo Egnazia. It feels like an eternity, doesn't it? Look how close we were to each other. Look how we all had smiles on our faces. Now we can't even see our smiles because of the masks we wear. 2 years ago, EU FMD Open session was still focused on FMD, and we started addressing the issue of vaccine security. Today, I will dive into one of the solutions that exist to address the lack of vaccines. They're called vaccine banks, or vaccine stockpiles, or strategic reserves. Whatever you call them, the model is not widely publicized. It is sometimes a little secret because of its strategic nature. So I think it'll be useful to share our experience in this forum. 2 years ago, our colleague George Matelot was still with us. He was a good scientist, a good man, and a friend. Dumela, ke gogo potse, my friend. Rest in peace, George. So I'll start with a few words on vaccine security. Vaccine security is the timely, sustained, uninterrupted supply of affordable vaccines of assured quality, according to the UNICEF and WHO definition. In practice, when are quality vaccines not available? Well, of course, when they don't exist, like for African swine fever or SARS-CoV-2, but also when there are no stocks readily available to serve the demand in time. The first point is the subject of another presentation. The second can be addressed by banks. They're truly a unique business model that can address sudden and unplanned demand for quality vaccines. Illustrate the challenges of our supply chain for FMD vaccines, I'll mention this. We have to manage a demand that is irregular, with constant competition between regular demand and peaks that can be due to outbreaks, but not only. Sometimes they're due to unexpected funding that's suddenly available. But unfortunately, there's no idle manufacturing capacity to respond to these surges anywhere. Then you have another issue. Sales forecasts are often unreliable because the market is mostly based on tenders or on orders with unrealistic expectations. For example, the vaccine shall be delivered within 10 weeks in some FAO tenders, when in fact it takes 6 months to produce a dose. So banks or strategic reserves remain the only available solution for rapid access to vaccine. The example I'll take in the rest of my presentation, the examples are mostly based on foot-and-mouth disease vaccine, but the conclusions apply to all vaccines. Now a little bit of history, a 50-year story actually. Who invented banks? Sorry, my Swiss colleagues, the idea actually came from England. I have to give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, even if it hurts. The first mention of vaccine strategic reserves for FMD control was made in the UK by a commission that was formed to review the lessons of the great epidemics of 1967. In the 70s, a famous French company demonstrated that you can store FMD antigen in a concentrated antigen form, concentrated and frozen form, sorry. In 79, the first Antigen Bank was put together by a group of countries from North America. In the 80s, there was an international vaccine bank, which did not survive the 90s. But banks really developed in the 90s after European countries stopped vaccination. So who can hold a bank? Obviously, countries that don't have the disease on their territory and want to be ready in case it's introduced. But not only, it can also be useful for endemic countries. For example, for exotic serotypes, Middle Eastern countries might see an interest in building an FMD bank with African strains or with Asian strains in case of a spillover from neighboring pools. Or they can also serve as a buffer stock of vaccine in case there is a sudden increase in demand. They can be national or regional banks. Actually, mutualization makes sense. Who supplies banks? Well, there's very few manufacturers that do. At Boehringer-Ingelheim, we hold banks for rabies, FMD, and Bluetongue. Other producers hold banks for lumpy skin disease and PPR. There are few of us because it takes a broad portfolio of strains to build a comprehensive bank, and it also takes a very specific expertise and investment in that kind of resources. It takes a dedicated team and dedicated processes. So the question everybody might be asking is, what's in a bank? Well, it's nothing like what you see on this. First, let's take the example of the FMD production process to highlight the different types of banks. To make an FMD vaccine, you need to grow cells, to infect them with the virus, to inactivate the virus, and then to purify it. All of this is biology, so it takes time. Roughly 4 months from start to inactivate an antigen. On the other hand, it takes only a few days to mix the antigen with the adjuvant, fill it into bottles, label it, and package it. So you can store the active ingredient. This is an antigen bank, or you can store the finished product. This is a vaccine bank. For FMD, both are possible. Banks can be final filled vaccine stocks stored at 4 degrees in bottles, or bulk antigen kept frozen at ultra-low temperatures, usually in the vapors of liquid nitrogen. From a manufacturer point of view, those two types of banks are not mutually exclusive. You can hold a combination of antigen banks and vaccine reserves. Some countries use this option, and you can work on the replacement schedule to minimize wastage of precious vaccine. So there are advantages and drawbacks to both models. I'll mention just a few. Delay is only one aspect. A vaccine is readily available, whereas an antigen has to be finished into vaccine and released before completion of the tests. So you have a few days difference. Shelf life is an important parameter. Antigens, FMD antigens at least, are very, very stable. They can be stored frozen for several years, whereas vaccines, FMD vaccines, have a relatively shorter shelf life, between 12 and 24 months, depending on the vaccine. Number of strains is another important one. With the antigen model, you can store each of the most important strains and decide at the last moment which one or which ones you want to put in the vaccine. With the vaccine model, composition is fixed. You can't change it at the last minute. So this is okay for rabies, which is one strain, but it's problematic for FMD. Location is another difference. You can store a vaccine at +4 degrees in multiple locations in your country, whereas antigens, well, they have to be stored at the manufacturer's premises because of the ultra-low temperature and the need to formulate rapidly. Sorry. After production, the antigens are stored in one of our facilities at Purbright in the UK or in Lyon in France, and then they're dedicated to a specific customer. There's restricted access to the vault, of course. Just 1 or 2 people who have access. Tanks are, of course, equipped with a range of probes and equipments to guarantee the security of the antigens. And we have to conduct periodic tests to ensure the stability of the antigens. We test 146S content yearly and serological potency at 0, 2.5, and 5 years. Now, let's look at what a bank activation looks like in practice. Let's say there is a clinical case of FMD in a European country. Is actually described in Article 50 of the European Union Directive on FMD. Emergency vaccination can be used if there's an outbreak in one of the member states and if it threatens to be widespread, or if there is a risk of spread to another member state. So here are the steps of a bank activation. First, you have to place the order, and the order we receive has to be very precise. We have people on call who are willing to, ready to take this important order, but it has to specify which strain have to be included in the vaccine, or which strains, number of doses that are needed, vial size, delivery details, where we have to ship it, timeline, how fast you want it, and early release certificate. It's a statement by the chief veterinary officer of the country that it's okay for us to deliver the vaccine prior to completion of the quality control tests. So then it's everyone on deck. It's an emergency for us. We stop everything we're doing. We formulate the vaccine, mix the antigen with the adjuvant. We fill it into bottles. We kept the bottles. We label the vials and put them in boxes. We have a commitment to supply the vaccine at the factory gate in less than a week. Conditions can vary depending on the contract we have. And then it's delivery to the customer. We can either put the vaccine in trucks if it's more rapid, otherwise we put it in airplanes and we ship it to any international airport. This is where it would happen. There are some pictures of our Pirbright laboratory. You can see our blending and filling labs there. We can formulate two types of vaccine upon request. It could be aqueous or oily. We can formulate several sizes of vials. And we can label in any language. We have our claims translated into all the languages of the European Union, and they can be printed at the last minute. Vaccines are put in boxes with ice packs and temperature loggers because it is, of course, critical to maintain cold chain conditions from our factory to the point of delivery. Finally, a very important point. In this emergency situation, you have no time to wait for final quality control results. This is a situation that is actually covered in the European Pharmacopoeia. In cases of emergency, it is okay to release the batch before completion of the tests, provided a sterility test has been carried out on the antigen and on all the components of the vaccine. And also that a potency test has been carried out on a small scale vaccine representative of the final batch. In summary, this is a complex process. It takes time to build such expertise. You need a dedicated team, you need a dedicated process, and dedicated equipment and supplies too. You need not only to store the antigen, but you also need to store adjuvant, sufficient volumes of adjuvant, enough bottles, enough labels, everything to be able to complete your formulation and ship it to your customer. It is a commitment because you might have to drop everything you're doing if the request comes. For example, if there's already a batch of vaccine being prepared in your formulation tanks, you might have to stop everything and throw it down the drain to make some room for your bank. And it takes practice. We have several activations every year. And we make a point of it because we've never failed to honor our commitments. I would say, of course, because it's like an insurance. You hope you never need it, but when you do, it had better deliver. To go back to a point I made earlier, banks can be useful in multiple environments. Today, the Antigen Bank model is mostly used by disease-free nations, FMD-free nations. We see initiatives towards mutualization of banks. There was an international vaccine bank in the 80s and 90s. The European Union and North America, they have mutualized banks. And the Quads have pledged to help each other. But there are some downsides to the model. There's some financial considerations. First, at the end of the storage period, some valuable antigen stock often has to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we see that policies and plans are not always there to allow vaccination campaigns to carry out with the vaccine that countries receive. And also, preferred options often remain 1, stamping out, and 2, vaccinate to kill. I will also mention that allocation rules for mutualized banks are not always clear. The rules to decide which country gets the vaccine first and how many doses if there are multiple outbreaks. Well, these rules are not always clear to us, but that's not up to us to decide. Sorry. As I said, banks are also a good model for endemic countries, either as a stockpile that is ready to respond to a certain surge in demand or to an outbreak due to an exotic strain. But it can also be seen as a way to trigger vaccination in developing countries, using pilot vaccination campaigns to demonstrate their benefits. Regional banks exist already. They're usually funded by international organizations. There is an OIE bank for Southeast Asia. It was funded by Australia, then New Zealand, but unfortunately it will stop soon. There is a rabies vaccine bank funded by the OIE and the WHO. And there is a PAHO rabies bank for South America. But really what we need is to build sustainability in the model. For countries in the early stages of PCP, donor funding is necessary, sure. But afterwards, I believe there should be greater support beyond funding towards putting in place the infrastructure for vaccination. And also a great deal of economic analyses, because you can use these pilot campaigns to generate some hard data showing the effectiveness and the benefits of vaccination for a country's agriculture. Once the infrastructure is in place, countries may realize that vaccines are only a fraction of the cost of a campaign and that they have the infrastructure to continue on their own. So I'll conclude with these final remarks. Antigens and vaccine banks are one of the solutions to reach vaccine security. Today, they're mostly used by disease-free countries as an insurance. That's part of their risk mitigation strategy to minimize the consequences of an outbreak. But really, they could also help minimize vaccine shortages in endemic countries. They may seem costly to put in place, but they would guarantee access to quality vaccines when they are needed.